A poor woman, driving through a heavy rainstorm, is shocked to find a millionaire unconscious on a rural road and decides to help him by taking him to her home. When the man recovers, what he says leaves her completely stunned. The rain hadn't stopped for hours. It poured relentlessly, washing over the winding back roads of the Tennessee hills with a steady roar. Emily Sanders tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles white, eyes straining to see beyond the wiper blades of her aging sedan. The headlights barely cut through the sheet of water ahead, illuminating only brief flashes of gravel and puddles as she navigated the narrow road home. Emily had just left the small-town market with a few essentials: a bag of flour, 2 cans of soup, and a half-gallon of milk. It was all she could afford after picking up her last paycheck from the now shuttered textile factory. That check, modest as it was, had to stretch for her and her 5-year-old son, Noah. The factory had been the town's main source of income for decades, but the owners had pulled out months ago, and nothing had come to take its place. Jobs were scarce. Opportunities even scarcer. Her cabin sat miles from the nearest paved road, tucked into a grove of weather-beaten trees. It wasn't much, just 2 bedrooms, a leaky roof, and creaky floorboards, but it was theirs. Emily had inherited it from her late grandmother and clung to it fiercely. Even as bills piled up and her options dwindled, she often reminded herself it was shelter, it was warm, and it kept her and Noah together. Thunder cracked overhead, rumbling so hard it shook the car windows. She winced, but kept driving. Noah was home with their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Cranston, who babysat him in exchange for fresh vegetables from Emily's modest garden when she had them. Tonight, though, the garden was flooded, and Emily's hands trembled with the weight of uncertainty as she guided the car through another bend. Her mind wandered, as it often did on nights like this, to what might have been. She'd once dreamed of becoming a nurse, but those plans had crumbled when she got pregnant during her final year of high school. Her boyfriend at the time had promised to stay, but promises in small towns were like the wind, easy to make and impossible to hold on to. He'd left before Noah was born, and Emily hadn't heard from him since. She adjusted the heater, though it barely worked, and tried to shake off the creeping cold in her bones. Her old car, a hand-me-down from a friend of her grandmother's, coughed and sputtered as the incline grew steeper. She knew every inch of this road, every rut, every hidden pothole, but tonight it felt unfamiliar under the storm's fury. As she rounded a sharp curve, her headlights caught something that made her slam on the brakes, a shape, a body. For a split second, she thought it was a deer, until she saw the outline of arms, legs, a head, human, lying near the edge of the road, face down, soaked to the bone. The car skidded to a halt, tires sliding on wet gravel. Her heart pounded. As she threw it into park and leapt out into the storm, the wind lashed at her coat, plastering her hair to her face as she raced toward the figure. Rain blinded her, but she saw enough to know he wasn't moving. "Sir!" she shouted over the storm, kneeling beside him. He didn't respond. She turned him over carefully, wincing at the blood trickling from a cut on his temple. His face was pale, lips bluish from the cold, but he was breathing, barely. She could feel the shallow rise and fall of his chest beneath the soaked fabric of his coat. "Okay," she whispered more to herself than to him. "Okay. I got you." Without a second thought, she hauled him up with all the strength she had, struggling against his weight and the slick mud beneath her boots. It took everything in her to drag him to the car and lay him across the back seat. Water pooled under him, soaking the upholstery, but she didn't care. She slammed the door shut, jumped back behind the wheel, and took off down the road toward home. All the while, her mind raced with questions. Who was he? What was he doing out here in the middle of nowhere, alone and injured? Had he crashed? Been attacked? Was someone looking for him? She glanced in the rearview mirror. His face was slack, his body unmoving. The cut on his head had stopped bleeding, but he looked fragile, almost ghostly in the dim light. Noah would be waiting. Mrs. Cranston, too. She prayed they wouldn't be scared when she brought home a stranger in the middle of a storm. But there was no other option. There was no hospital nearby, no police station open this late, not on these back roads. And if she called an ambulance, it might never reach them in time. She had done what any decent person would do. At least, she hoped. So, as the car creaked up the final hill toward the cabin, Emily felt the weight of the night settling on her shoulders. The storm wasn't letting up, and now her quiet world had been shattered by a stranger on the roadside. She had no way of knowing how much that one decision would change everything, but deep down, as she pulled into the driveway and looked back at the unconscious man, she felt it. Something big had just begun. Emily barely had time to park before rushing around to the back seat. The man was still unconscious, his head tilted awkwardly against the window, hair soaked and plastered to his forehead. The blood on his temple had dried slightly during the drive, forming a jagged line that made him look even more fragile under the dim interior light. She opened the back door and hesitated for a heartbeat. Her instincts screamed that this was more than just an injured traveler. But the other part of her, the stronger maternal side that knew what it meant to be abandoned and helpless, refused to let fear win. She wrapped her arms around his chest and tried to lift, struggling under his weight. His coat was drenched and heavy, and she could feel every shift in his unconscious body as she braced herself to pull him upright. Her arms burned, her back ached, but she refused to give up. Inch by inch, she guided him out of the car, stumbling backward toward the front porch of the cabin. Noah stood in the open doorway, holding a worn blanket and staring wide-eyed into the night. "Mommy?" His voice was barely a whisper over the rain. "Go inside, sweetheart," she said quickly. "Get the pillows off the couch." Without questioning her, Noah ran back in. Emily reached the porch, muscles shaking, legs trembling. With one final heave, she dragged the man inside, kicking the door shut behind her. The storm continued to rage outside, battering the cabin's wooden walls, but inside, it was warm, if modest. She lowered the man onto the couch with a grunt and stepped back, soaked to the skin. He looked even worse in the light. His skin was pale and clammy, lips still tinged with blue. His designer coat, something clearly expensive even under all the mud and water, clung to his body like a second skin. Emily knelt beside him, fingers brushing his pulse. Still there, still faint. "Is he dead?" Noah asked, standing a few feet away, clutching the blanket to his chest. "No, baby. He's just hurt." Emily moved quickly, tossing her wet coat onto a hook and grabbing towels from the small linen closet. She worked fast, wiping the man's face, cleaning the blood from his temple as gently as she could. Noah handed her the blanket and she wrapped it around him tightly, tucking it under his arms. The man didn't stir. The fire in the hearth was low, nearly out, but Emily added more wood, coaxing it back to life. The glow spread slowly through the room, casting flickering shadows on the walls. She sat back, studying the stranger's face. He looked to be in his 40s, maybe older. His jawline was sharp, now rough with stubble, and though his features were handsome, there was a certain tiredness to them, like he'd carried something heavy for too long. As minutes passed, the warmth began to take hold. His breathing grew stronger, still unconscious but more stable. Emily finally allowed herself to exhale. She stood and turned to Noah, who was now sitting on the floor, watching intently. "Go. Back to bed, honey." "But what if he wakes up?" "Then I'll be right here." Noah nodded slowly and got up, giving the stranger one last glance before disappearing into his small room. Emily sat back down, wiping rain from her hair with the edge of her sweater. She didn't move for a long time, eyes fixed on the man's face. Her thoughts spun. Who was he? What had happened? What kind of person ended up unconscious on a rural road with no explanation? She had found no wallet on him, no phone, nothing in his coat pockets but a pen and a key fob for a car that wasn't nearby. That alone unsettled her. If he'd crashed, there should have been wreckage. If he'd been walking, there should have been a bag at least. But there was nothing. Eventually, exhaustion pulled at her limbs. She rose slowly and grabbed an old chair from the corner, dragging it beside the couch. She couldn't risk leaving. Him alone, not yet. She wrapped herself in a quilt and settled in, the warmth of the fire slowly lulling her into a shallow sleep. The storm raged on outside, unrelenting. Morning came slowly, grey light filtering in through the cracked blinds. Emily stirred in her chair, her neck aching. The fire had died down again, leaving only embers glowing faintly in the hearth. She blinked, adjusting to the light. Then she heard it, A groan. Her head snapped around. The man had moved, just slightly, his fingers twitching under the blanket. His lips parted as another low sound escaped him. Emily stood quickly, her heart pounding. "Hey," she said softly, stepping closer. "You're safe. You're okay." His eyes fluttered open, blinking against the dim light. He looked confused, disoriented. His gaze moved across the ceiling, then landed on her. "Where?" His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "You're in my home," she said gently. "I found you on the road. You were hurt." He struggled to sit up, but winced, a hand going to his head. What happened?" "I was hoping you could tell me." He closed his eyes for a second, breathing deeply. "I don't remember." "That's okay," she replied, trying to sound calm. "Just take it easy. You've been unconscious since last night. You're lucky I found you." His eyes moved around the room. Simple furniture, old floorboards, a small shelf of children's books, and a drawing by Noah pinned to the wall. "This is your house?" "Yes." He looked at her again, more carefully this time. "You helped me." She nodded. Anyone would have. A strange look crossed his face, something unreadable. He started to say something else, but stopped, his hand pressing to the bandage she'd made from one of her kitchen towels. Emily stepped back. "I'm Emily," she said. "And you are?" He hesitated. His mouth opened, then closed again. The pause stretched too long. "My name is—" He looked around again, eyes narrowing. Then, finally, "Richard. Richard Halbrook." The name didn't ring a bell immediately. Emily frowned. "Okay, Richard. Do you know how you got here?" He didn't answer. She glanced toward the radio on the shelf. Static hummed softly from the speaker, but then a voice cut through. "And the search continues for missing tech magnate Richard Halbrook, whose disappearance 3 days ago has sparked national headlines." Emily froze. Her heart skipped. She turned slowly to look at the man again, suddenly seeing him with new eyes, the expensive coat, the designer boots, the refined features, and then his name. He was watching her, silently. "You're that Richard Halbrook," she whispered, disbelief washing over her. He didn't deny it, didn't nod, just watched her with something between weariness and resignation. In that moment, everything in Emily's world shifted. Emily stood frozen, the faint buzz of the radio crackling behind her like a ghost whispering, secrets she was never meant to hear. The name had hit her like a jolt of electricity, Richard Halbrook. The name she'd just heard, spoken calmly and without a trace of irony by the man lying on her couch, was the same name echoing across the airwaves as part of a national alert. She didn't need more confirmation, but she looked again at the man's face, noticing now what she had missed in her urgency to help him. The unmistakable signs of someone who didn't belong in her world. The clothes, though soaked and muddy, were clearly high-end. The subtle watch still strapped to his wrist, gold beneath the grime. His posture, even while weakened, had a certain refinement. And now the name. He watched her closely, gauging her reaction. His face remained calm, but there was tension behind his eyes, as if waiting to see whether she'd run or demand answers. "I heard your name on the radio," she finally said, her voice quiet, as if saying it any louder would shatter the fragile balance between them. "They said you've been missing for 3 days." He nodded, slowly, one hand rubbing at his temple as if trying to massage a memory loose. "That's correct. At least I think so. Everything is a bit foggy." Emily crossed her arms, not out of suspicion, but to keep herself grounded. She felt like the floor beneath her had shifted. "What happened to you?" "I don't... So no." His eyes drifted away from her face, settling on the flickering embers in the hearth. "I remember driving. I remember someone following me. Then nothing. Just blackness. Until I woke up here." The silence stretched long. Emily's thoughts spun faster than she could process. A billionaire was lying on her couch, in her house. After she found him half dead on a road, no one else. Traveled. It didn't make sense. It felt too strange, too sudden, like a plot pulled from a TV movie. And yet, here he was. Flesh and blood. Breathing. Real. Noah's voice broke the tension. "Mommy, I'm hungry." She turned, startled, and gave him a reassuring nod. "I'll get you something, sweetheart. Just give me a minute." When she turned back to Richard, he was attempting to sit up more fully, clearly wincing with every movement. "You shouldn't push it," she said, walking over to steady him. "You took quite a hit." "I can't stay lying down forever," he muttered, and she could hear the strain in his voice, the frustration of someone used to being in control and now utterly powerless. "You're safe here," she said, guiding him back gently, "but you're not in any shape to make decisions just yet." He chuckled dryly. "I've made worse decisions than listening to you." Emily didn't answer. She moved to the kitchen, pulling open a couple of cabinets. Canned soup again. It was all she had left. She heated it quietly, the silence in the room growing heavier by the second. When she returned with a bowl, Richard took it with a soft thank you and sipped slowly. He seemed more lucid now, though still guarded. Emily sat down across from him, watching carefully. "I know this is a lot," he said after a while, looking up. "I know how it must look." "Do you?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. "You show up out of nowhere, unconscious, bleeding on the side of the road. You say you're Richard Halbrook, and then the radio confirms it. You've been missing for days. People are probably out there searching, and I'm just here in the middle of it." "I didn't plan this," he replied, setting the bowl aside. "I didn't expect to survive. Do you remember anything useful? A name? A face? Anything?" He closed his eyes, lips pressing into a thin line. "Just shadows." A voice. "On the phone. A meeting that felt wrong. I was in Nashville. I had dinner with someone from my board, then I drove myself home. Or I tried. That's where it ends." Emily stared at him, struggling to reconcile the man in front of her with the figure the news portrayed. A billionaire tech mogul, a man of influence and ambition. She barely owned a working cell phone, and this man probably made more money in a single day than she had in 10 years. And yet he was here, helpless, and for some reason she had become part of his story. She remembered the name now. It had come up a few times in local news, usually tied to philanthropy or tech innovation. Halbrook Systems, some kind of high-level, cloud computing empire. She never paid attention. It was a world too far from her own, but now that world had arrived on her couch, asking for soup and answers. Noah returned, sitting on the rug beside the fire with a toy truck. He glanced at Richard, clearly fascinated. "Is he a hero, Mommy?" he asked. Emily blinked. "What?" "He looks like someone from the movies, the kind who saves people." Richard smiled faintly. "That's kind of you, little man. But right now I think your mom saved me." Noah grinned and went back to his toy, as if that answered everything. Later that morning, after Richard fell back into an exhausted sleep, Emily slipped out onto the porch. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a mist that hung low over the hills. The air was heavy, still. She sat on the top step, arms wrapped around her knees, and tried to sort through the storm of thoughts in her head. She could call the police. It was the logical thing to do. But something made her hesitate. He hadn't asked for help. He hadn't pleaded for her to reach out to anyone. In fact, when he mentioned people following him, there had been fear in his voice, real fear, not paranoia. What if he was right? What if someone had tried to kill him? And if so, why? The questions had no answers yet. But one thing was certain. Until he was strong enough to stand and speak for himself, she wasn't going to risk putting him back in harm's way. By the time she returned inside, he was awake again, sitting upright, staring at the floor. "You okay?" she asked. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something unguarded in his expression, vulnerability. "I don't know who to trust anymore," he said quietly. Emily nodded. "Then you're lucky I have nothing to gain." He didn't smile, but his eyes softened. Outside, the storm clouds were finally beginning to break. The sun was barely a pale smudge behind the clouds, when Emily poured Richard another cup of the instant coffee she kept for special mornings. It wasn't much, cheap, bitter and weak, but he accepted it with a murmured thank you, hands still trembling slightly from the aftershock of his ordeal. They sat at the small wooden table near the window, the kind of table that had witnessed birthday cakes with one candle too few and long nights with overdue bills. Now it had become a strange ground zero for something far beyond Emily's understanding. Richard stared into the steaming cup, his fingers tightening around the ceramic as if it tethered him to something real. Across from him, Emily said nothing, just watched and waited. She had learned long ago that silence could be louder than questions. He finally broke it. "This place, it's so quiet." "It's always quiet here," she said. "Most folks." "I moved away when the factory closed. The rest just kind of drifted inward. It's just me, Noah, and a few old neighbors now. And the trees, I guess." He gave a hollow smile. "You live alone with your son?" She nodded. "No family nearby?" "None that talked to me." That was true in every sense. After her mother died, there was no one left who hadn't turned their back on her. Getting pregnant at 18 in a town like hers had made her an outcast. She learned to survive with what she had, and trust rarely came easy anymore. "You didn't hesitate," he said after a long pause. "When you saw me out there, you just pulled over." "I thought you were dying," she replied simply. "Didn't matter who you were." Richard looked down again, his jaw tightening. There was something in his silence that unsettled her, a heaviness he hadn't yet explained. She leaned forward. "What is it you're not saying?" He looked up at her, eyes glassy but focused. "If I tell you, you won't believe me. Try me." He hesitated again, but this time it wasn't uncertainty. It was calculation. A man who had likely spent years measuring the impact of every word he spoke. But now, stripped of his empire and power, he had only the truth to cling to, and he chose to speak it. "My name is Richard Halbrook," he said more firmly now. "I own Halbrook Systems. 3 days ago, I was at a dinner meeting with 2 of my board members in Nashville. After dinner, I got into my car and I noticed something strange. A black SUV I'd seen earlier at the hotel valet pulled out behind me. I took a few extra turns to see if they'd follow. They did." He paused to take a sip of the coffee, grimaced at the taste, and set it down. "I made a call to my assistant, told her I might not come home that night. I didn't say why, I just said I had a bad feeling. Then I headed toward my cabin in the mountains, a private place I keep for when I need to disappear, but I never made it there." Emily kept her eyes on him. "Do you think they forced you off the road?" "I don't know. I remember the headlights behind me. I remember turning onto a road I didn't recognize, trying to lose them, and then nothing." His eyes lost focus for a second, as if trying to trace the blank space in his memory. "When I woke up here," he continued, "I thought maybe I'd crashed. But there's no wrecked car, no bruises on my arms or legs like I hit anything hard. Just the head injury." Emily nodded slowly. "And now you think someone was trying to... what? Kill you?" "I think someone wanted me gone. Long enough to do something I'd never agree to. Maybe longer." The weight of his words settled. Between them, Emily felt it in her chest, that slow churn of dread that told her this was no ordinary accident. It wasn't even just a mystery anymore. It was a threat, one that might already be pressing toward them from the world beyond the trees. "Why would anyone want that?" she asked. "What would they gain from you disappearing?" He let out a slow breath. "Control. My company is on the verge of a major acquisition, one that would give us dominance in cybersecurity across half the federal market, billions of dollars. If I vanished, the board could be manipulated, agreements could be signed without me, and if I were found dead, well, a few people might even celebrate." Emily leaned back, the old wood of her chair creaking beneath her. The scale of what he was saying was incomprehensible. She had trouble imagining thousands of dollars, let alone billions. She didn't understand the corporate world, but she knew greed and she knew fear. And what she heard in his voice now was both. "I don't know who I can trust," he added. "Even the people closest to me, especially them. If I make a move now too soon, I risk exposing myself before I understand what's going on. And me, she asked carefully. You trust me? I trust what you did for me, he said, and that's more than I can say for anyone else right now. They sat in silence again, the cabin unusually still. Noah was in the next room, playing with his toy trucks, humming to himself. The moment felt suspended, as if something were about to crack open. Then Richard reached into his coat, which Emily had hung by the door to dry. He pulled from an inner pocket a small item, wet but still intact. A security key fob, the kind used to access encrypted data or secure buildings. He looked at it like it held a piece of the truth. I need to get to a secure line, he said. Not yet, but soon. And I need your help to figure out what happened. Out there? Emily raised an eyebrow. I work part-time at the market when they let me. I'm not exactly CIA material. You're the only person I've met in years who helped without asking why, he replied. That means more than, you know. A strange quiet fell over the room again. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees like a distant warning. Emily had no illusions about what she was walking into, but she also knew something deep in her bones. This wasn't a man spinning lies. She saw the truth in his fear. And she understood the instinct to run when the world turned on you. I'll help you, she said finally, but we do it my way. Richard nodded. Your way might be the only one that works. The day passed slowly, tension hanging in the air like a storm refusing to break. But Emily no longer felt like a passive observer. She was part of this now, whether she liked it or not. And as she watched Richard fall into a restless sleep again, murmuring something she couldn't quite understand, she knew with absolute certainty this was only the beginning. The wind shifted that evening, dragging with it a dampness that made the walls of the cabin feel even thinner than they were. Emily stood by the stove, stirring a pot of reheated beans and rice, while Richard sat quietly at the kitchen table. He hadn't spoken much since his last confession, and though the silence wasn't uncomfortable, it held a tension that pressed on Emily like a weight she couldn't quite name. Noah had finally fallen asleep, after a day filled with whispered warnings and distractions, meant to keep his young mind away from questions he wasn't ready to ask. Emily had told him Richard was a friend who needed rest, and Noah had accepted. That answer with the simplicity only a child could muster. But Emily knew that innocence would not last long. The world had a way of catching up, even here. She turned off the stove and carried 2 plates to the table, sliding one in front of Richard. He looked at it for a moment before nodding in quiet gratitude. This is the best thing I've smelled in days, he said. It's all I had left that wasn't canned or frozen. He took a bite, slowly, chewing with care. Emily ate in silence, the soft clink of their forks the only sound between them. She glanced at him now and then, noting how much stronger he looked, still pale, still tired, but sharper, more focused. Whatever confusion had fogged his thoughts earlier was beginning to lift. After they finished, Emily stacked the dishes in the sink and filled it with hot water, the steam rising like a veil between her and the rest of the room. She didn't look at Richard when she asked, "What's the next move?" He didn't answer right away. When she turned back, he was sitting with his elbows on the table, hands clasped together, staring at the wood grain like it held some kind of code. "I need to tell you something," he said finally. "Something I've told no one." Emily dried her hands and sat across from him again. "Okay." He took a deep breath, then spoke, his voice lower now, measured. "What I'm about to say can't leave this room." She nodded. "It won't." Richard leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "A week before I disappeared, I found something." Emily didn't speak. She let him continue, the room around them shrinking with every word. "In my company's secure data vault, I ran a system audit. Routine, something I do personally every quarter. It's tedious, but I always check the logs myself. That time I found access records that didn't belong. A breach, subtle, deeply embedded, almost perfect. Someone was siphoning encrypted files from our private government contracts." Emily's heart began to beat faster, her stomach tightening. "At first I thought it was a bug. I even blamed our own IT staff. But when I traced the access route, I found a hidden pathway, custom-coded. It bypassed our firewalls entirely, not by force but from within. You mean someone inside your company? He nodded. Not just someone. It was traced to my assistant's terminal. Emily's brow furrowed. The one you called the night you went missing? Yes. Her name is Callie Barrett. She's been with me for 7 years. Trusted, close, too close maybe. She has access to everything, calendar, passwords, accounts. At that level, she might as well be me in digital form. Did you confront her? No, I hesitated. Wanted to be sure. I wanted proof before I made a move. So I planted false data, decoy files about a fake merger with a rival company. I watched as those files were accessed 2 nights later through the same breach. And you still didn't act? I was about to, he admitted. That dinner I mentioned where I was last seen, it was supposed to be my moment to expose. The leak discreetly. I had documents, encrypted backups, a prepared statement for the board. Emily leaned forward. So you were silenced before you could go through with it? I think so. I left the restaurant early, planning to return to my private cabin and run one final diagnostic. I had the documents in my bag. That bag is gone now. His voice shook slightly as he finished, not from fear, but from something more haunting. The frustration of a man whose world had been stolen from under him, piece by piece. Whoever did this, Emily, they didn't just want to delay me. They wanted me erased, not just from the company, but from the equation entirely. Emily stared at him, her mind racing. Why not go to the authorities now? Because I don't know how far this goes, he said. If it's just Callie or if she's a pawn for someone bigger. If I call the wrong person, I could walk right into a trap. She sat back in her chair, letting the enormity of it settle over her. And me, why tell me all this? Because I needed someone to know, he said. Someone outside of that world, someone I trust. The room felt colder now, though the fire still crackled faintly in the hearth. Emily stood and walked to the window, staring out at the moonlit silhouette of the trees. Her reflection stared back at her, tired, wary, and strangely resolved. I don't know what kind of help you think I can be, she said. But I've got no connections, no resources. I can't even afford new shoes for my kid. Richard rose slowly, his movement still stiff but steadier than before. You've got something more valuable than any of that, he said. She turned. What? You've got nothing to lose. The words struck her like a match. She understood exactly what he meant. People with nothing to lose are dangerous. People with nothing to protect but their own truth. Those were the ones who made bold moves because fear no longer had a place to live. Emily nodded slowly. Then let's make sure they regret not finishing the job. For the first time since he arrived, Richard smiled. Not a weak, weary smile, but something sharper. A glint of resolve, of partnership. He reached into his coat once again and pulled out a flash drive, setting it on the table. This is all that's left. Encrypted, triple-backed. I need your help checking where I was found. We start there, maybe something was left behind. Emily looked at the device, then at him. The weight of the moment settled over her shoulders, like armor. First light, she said. We go before anyone else does. And just like that, a new alliance was formed, not of equals in power, but of necessity, of defiance, of two people pushed to the edge and daring to push back. The morning air was sharper than Emily had expected, cutting through her coat like thin blades of ice. Dawn had not yet broken when she and Richard stepped out of the cabin, the woods around them still cloaked in the blue darkness of pre-light. The gravel crunched under their feet as they made their way to the car. It was old, rust-framed and temperamental, but it was all she had, and today it would have to be enough. Richard moved slowly, still favoring his right side as he walked. But his focus was evident. The pain he'd been carrying seemed diminished now, replaced by a clarity of purpose. Emily noticed it in the way he scanned their surroundings, in how he studied the road as though expecting someone or something to appear at any moment. It unsettled her. Her world had never required this level of vigilance. Now she found herself mirroring his tension without even realizing it. Once inside the car, Emily turned the ignition. The engine sputtered, groaned, then finally caught. They drove in silence for a while, the fog thick and low. The trees on either side of the road stood like tall, watching figures, their branches motionless in the morning stillness. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Emily asked, eyes on the road. "You're still not fully healed." "I don't have the luxury of time," Richard replied. "Whoever left me for dead might realize I survived. If they do, they'll come looking. And if they're already looking, then we find what we can before they do." Emily didn't respond. She kept her hands firm on the wheel as they approached the curve where she had first seen him lying in the rain, broken and barely alive. The place looked different now. The water had receded, revealing the deep grooves of tire tracks, scattered leaves, and disturbed mud that hadn't yet been smoothed by time. She pulled over and killed the engine. They both stepped out cautiously, the chills seeping through their clothes. Emily led the way, stepping over roots and patches of damp ground until they reached the spot where she had found him. Richard looked around, frowning as though willing a memory to surface. "This is it," Emily said. "You were right there." He knelt, touching the ground, fingertips skimming the mud and grass. "It feels familiar." Together they scoured the area. Emily checked the underbrush for anything that might have been discarded. Richard followed the faint trail left by the tires, his eyes constantly scanning. Then he froze. "Emily." She turned. He was holding something small and metallic. She hurried over. "It's part of a phone," he said. "It looks like the SIM tray. Someone tried to destroy it." Emily took it, inspecting the bent metal. "Yours?" "No. I use satellite communication for sensitive calls. This is a standard carrier piece." She looked around again. Whoever it belonged to, they didn't want it found. They kept searching, finding bits of broken plastic, shattered glass, fragments of a phone clearly smashed against the rock. A deliberate act. Emily gathered what she could into a plastic bag she'd brought, watching as Richard's eyes grew darker with each discovery. On their way back to the car, he stopped abruptly. "I need to ask something." Emily turned, wiping her hands on her jeans. "What is it?" He hesitated for a moment, then said, "I don't want you to call the police." "Not yet." She stared at him, startled. "You're serious?" "Yes." "Richard, I found a man half dead on the road. He turns out to be a billionaire who's been missing for 3 days. Now we're uncovering evidence that someone might have tried to kill you, and you're asking me not to involve the authorities." He met her gaze steady. "If we bring them in now, we risk alerting the wrong people. I don't know who to trust. This breach, it wasn't just someone accessing confidential files. It was targeted. It required help from the inside. And if the police are connected, anyway, this all vanishes." Emily paced for a moment, then turned back. "And you trust me more than people who are trained to deal with this?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because you saved me, without asking for anything." The air between them felt taut, stretched by the weight of truth neither of them wanted to fully accept. Emily didn't like the idea of being part of a conspiracy. She was a single mother, already exhausted by daily life. This wasn't her world. And yet, the decision had already been made the night she pulled over in the rain. There was no walking away from it now. "Fine," she said, her voice steady. "But I'm not risking my son's safety. If anything even feels wrong, we end this." Agreed. As they drove back, Emily felt the shift happening inside her. What had begun as an act of kindness was now something else, an alliance built on thin strands of trust and necessity. She didn't know where this path led, but she understood something Richard likely had only recently discovered. Sometimes survival isn't about strength. It's about choosing to move forward when everything around you says to stop. Later that day, Richard sat in the living room with Noah, watching the boy explain the rules of a game involving mismatched puzzle pieces and plastic dinosaurs. Emily listened from the kitchen, her hands busy with dishes, but her ears tuned to the easy rhythm of their voices. For all his wealth and complexity, Richard seemed at ease with her son, answering questions patiently, laughing at silly jokes. It was disarming. After Noah went to bed, Richard joined her on the porch. The stars had emerged between the thinning clouds, scattering the sky with quiet brilliance. Emily handed him a cup of warm tea, then leaned against the railing. "You're not what I expected," she said. "I've been told that before. What happens if we don't find the truth?" He looked out at the woods. Then they win. And if we do, then I take back everything they tried to steal. The stillness stretched again. Emily could feel it. The moment before. Something changes when the world holds its breath. I'm in, she said. Richard turned to her. You sure? No. But that's never stopped me before. In that instant, there was no billionaire, no single mother, just two people standing on the edge of something far bigger than either of them, choosing to face it together. The days in the hills of Tennessee passed slowly, each one thick with tension that pulsed beneath the surface of routine. Richard's physical recovery advanced with each sunrise, though the bruise on his temples still bore the fading memory of violence. Emily, meanwhile, carried her concern like a stone in her chest, one she never showed in front of Noah, who continued to view their houseguest as a visiting hero from some unseen adventure. But in the quiet moments, when the boy was at Mrs. Cranston's and the house fell into silence, Emily and Richard worked. They pored over the fragments collected from the roadside, slivers of broken plastic and metal from the smashed phone, the battered SIM card tray, the trail of tire marks Richard had drawn from memory. With nothing more than a 10-year-old laptop, a half-broken USB adapter, and Richard's technical knowledge, they tried to piece together the first real picture of what had happened the night he vanished. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he connected the salvaged flash drive to the laptop. The screen flickered, then displayed a series of encrypted folders. Emily sat across the table from him, watching his face for any sign of revelation. The files were labeled with dates, client codes, strings of seemingly meaningless numbers, until Richard's eyes froze on a folder marked with the name Atlas Protocol. I know this, he muttered. Emily leaned in. What is it? A project proposal from last year, he said slowly. It was shelved. High-level security infrastructure for federal contractors. Too sensitive to implement without full board approval. We tabled it indefinitely. But someone accessed it. Yes, he replied. And modified it. He opened the folder. Inside were documents bearing digital fingerprints, not just from internal company developers, but from outside addresses Richard didn't recognize. Most disturbing of all was a string of updates logged after the project had been cancelled, proof that someone had resurrected the program under a false clearance level. They're preparing to sell it, he said. This isn't just data. Theft, they're weaponizing our tech. Emily stared at the screen, trying to wrap her head around the implications. Who would buy something like that? Foreign governments, corporations, anyone who benefits from destabilizing the current infrastructure. And if it goes through, it won't just be a scandal. It'll be a national security crisis. The gravity of the moment settled between them. Emily reached for her coffee, suddenly aware of how cold her hands felt. So what do we do? We trace the leak, Richard said. Who accessed what, when, and where, and we start with the person I trusted most. Your assistant. Callie, he confirmed. But we don't confront her yet. We dig. Quietly. He returned to the flash drive, typing rapidly, bypassing security protocols with an ease that reminded Emily exactly how far apart their worlds were. She watched him work, his jaw tight, shoulders tense. It wasn't just a matter of recovering stolen secrets anymore. She saw in his expression the pain of betrayal. This was personal now. The next morning, Emily drove to town under the pretense of running errands. In truth, she was looking for someone who might remember seeing Richard's car or anything suspicious near the time he disappeared. The local mechanic, a grizzled man named Carl, who remembered every vehicle that had ever passed through the valley, shook his head when she asked. No cars out of place that night, he said, except maybe that silver SUV I saw pulled off the side of the highway round sundown. Didn't think nothing of it. Silver SUV? Emily's heart raced. You remember where exactly? Carl scratched his beard and pointed toward the direction of the abandoned ranger station. Close to that old service trail. Ain't nobody goes up there anymore. Back at the cabin, she relayed the information to Richard. He pulled up a topographic map on the laptop and pinpointed the route. That's not far from where you found me, he said. If they stashed my car, it could be up that trail. They waited until nightfall to avoid unwanted attention. With Noah safe at Mrs. Cranston's again, they took flashlights and Richard's borrowed hiking boots, 2 sizes too big but functional, and headed for the trail Carl had mentioned. The path was overgrown, branches clawing at their jackets as they climbed the incline. The silence here was different than in the woods around Emily's home. It was heavier, more watchful. An hour into their search, the light from Emily's flashlight caught a glint of something metallic. "There," she whispered. They pushed through the brush until they reached the edge of a narrow clearing. At its center, half covered by a camouflaged tarp, sat a sleek black SUV. Not silver, new, powerful. Richard approached it cautiously, brushing aside the tarp and checking the license plate. "It's mine," he said almost to himself. He tried the driver's side door. Locked. Emily circled the vehicle, shining her light through the window. "Anything inside?" He peered through the glass. "My bag. Still there. Looks like it hasn't been touched." They took photos of the vehicle and the surrounding area, documenting everything. Richard marked the GPS coordinates on his phone and noted the tire size for comparison later. He didn't touch the SUV any more than necessary. No fingerprints, no mistakes. "We need someone on the inside," Emily said as they hiked back. "Someone who can get us information without tipping off the others." "I might have one name," Richard replied, "but I haven't spoken to him in months." They paused as a branch snapped somewhere in the distance. The forest fell silent again. Emily turned off her flashlight, holding her breath. "Did you hear that?" Richard nodded. "We're not alone." They waited, listening, but the sound didn't repeat. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered the rest of the walk back. Once safely home, Richard made the call from a burner phone they had picked up during one of Emily's town visits. The line was encrypted, but his voice was cautious. "Victor," he said, "it's Richard, I need your help." And this call never happened. He hung up without waiting for a response. Emily didn't ask who Victor was. She knew by now that some things were better left unspoken until the time was right. Instead, she locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and sat at the kitchen table watching the dark press against the glass. They were no longer in the phase of wondering what had happened. Now they were hunting. The early morning fog had not yet lifted when Emily and Richard returned to the stretch of road where it all began. The trees loomed taller now, or perhaps they simply felt more imposing, like they too carried secrets. Emily parked on the gravel shoulder, her old sedan rumbling to a reluctant stop. Neither of them spoke as they stepped out, the tension between them heavier than the cold that lingered in the air. The sun was just beginning to pierce the mist, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the asphalt. Richard adjusted. The straps of the backpack he carried, filled with tools, a flashlight, and a camera they had borrowed from Mrs. Cranston, who had lent it without questions after Emily had told her they were working on a photography project for Noah's school. The lie had rolled off her tongue too easily, another reminder of how far her life had shifted from normal. They crossed the road to the precise point where Emily had found Richard collapsed just days ago. Time had already begun its slow process of erasing the evidence. The mud was drier, the tire marks fainter, the broken branches along the edge now bent rather than snapped. But something in Richard's posture said he remembered more than he let on. He crouched near the shoulder, brushing away leaves and debris until he found the exact spot where his blood had stained the ground. He touched it, not out of sentiment, but as a marker. This was where the silence of those lost hours had begun. "If they dumped me here," he said, "they wanted someone to find me eventually." Emily frowned. "You sure?" "There's too much exposure. If they really wanted me dead and gone, they'd have taken me deeper into the woods or off a cliff. This was intentional, like a message or a mistake." They moved together down the side of the road, searching carefully. Richard kept his eyes on the gravel, his mind seemingly replaying every second he could recall. Then, not far, from the edge of the tree line, Emily spotted something partially buried beneath the underbrush. A piece of dark plastic about the size of her hand, chipped and scored along the edges. She pulled it free and turned it over, the corner of a camera casing. "Security device," Richard said instantly, taking it from her hands. "Rugged, military grade, probably mounted on a vehicle. Could it have recorded what happened? If it was running, yes, but we'll need the rest of it, and the storage unit. They spread out, carefully combing the area. After nearly an hour of slow, deliberate searching, Emily called out again. This time she had something more substantial, a weathered black box, half buried beneath a layer of pine needles and soaked leaves. She lifted it cautiously, revealing the cracked lens and the intact memory card slot. Richard joined her and exhaled softly. This is it. If there's footage, we'll know exactly who was here. They carried the equipment back to the car, wrapping it in towels to keep it dry. Back at the cabin, they set up the old laptop. Once more, connecting the memory card with a trembling mix of anticipation and dread. The files loaded slowly, the machine struggling with the weight of modern media on outdated hardware. Then a grainy video appeared on the screen. It showed the stretch of road, the shadows of trees swaying, and then headlights. A black SUV, just like the one they had found days before. The image shook slightly as the vehicle pulled to the side. Two figures stepped out. One stayed by the driver's door. The other moved toward the back, opening it, and dragging a limp body into the E. Open. Emily's breath caught. It was Richard. The timestamp confirmed the date of his disappearance. The camera, angled from what looked like a broken mount, caught only part of the scene. The men didn't speak, or if they did, it was too quiet to catch. One of them crouched next to Richard's body, checking his pulse or perhaps just ensuring he wouldn't wake up. Then they returned to the vehicle and drove off, their taillights vanishing into the dark. The final few seconds of the footage showed something curious. A third car approaching from the opposite direction, its headlights briefly illuminating the area before veering away, continuing down the road without stopping. Emily pointed. That must have been just before I came through. Richard stared at the screen, face rigid. This changes everything. They copied the footage to multiple drives, securing them in different places throughout the house. Richard insisted on placing one in a waterproof container beneath the floorboards, a trick he had learned in the early days of his corporate climb, when paranoia was still a whisper rather than a scream. Later that night, they sat by the fire, the footage replaying silently in the background as if to remind them of what they were now part of. Richard scribbled names and timelines in a notebook, drawing connections between events, people, and data. I recognize one of the men, he said suddenly, the one near the back of the car. He worked security at one of our partner firms, Dameron Intel. Is that important? Very. Dameron handles internal audits for half of our subsidiaries. If someone at that level is involved, the breach goes deeper than we thought. Emily absorbed this in silence. The names meant little to her, but she understood the implications. Someone had gone to great lengths not only to steal from Richard's company, but to silence him permanently. And now they were leaving behind evidence that might be their undoing. We need to talk to this Victor guy, Emily said. He won't meet in person unless I give him something. Proof I'm not compromised. She thought for a moment. The video. No, Richard said, shaking his head. Not yet. That's our insurance. But there's a log on the flash drive, emails between the compromised terminals. If I show him that, he'll come. They agreed to make contact the next day. In the meantime, they bolted the doors, turned off all unnecessary lights, and kept the fire low. Emily sat awake long into the night, watching the flames dance across Richard's face as he drifted into a fitful sleep on the couch. Her thoughts turned again and again to the camera footage, the ease with which the men had discarded him, like trash on the roadside. It was only luck or fate that had placed her on that road at the right time. But luck, she knew, wouldn't be enough to protect them anymore. They needed a plan, and fast. Morning came without ceremony, the light pale and cold as it filtered through the thin curtains of Emily's cabin. Outside, the trees swayed with a restless wind, and the sky held the bruised tint of a storm, gathering somewhere just out of sight. Inside, the mood was quieter, but equally tense. Richard had barely slept. His body still ached from his injuries, but his mind was sharper than it had been since he arrived, awake now not just to danger, but to purpose. Emily moved through the kitchen in silence, her hands working with muscle memory as she prepared coffee and reheated leftovers. She didn't have to ask what came next. They were past the stage of wondering whether to act. Now the question was how to survive the storm they had uncovered. Richard sat at the table with the flash drive plugged into the old laptop, his eyes scanning lines of code and encrypted logs with practiced intensity. At some point, Emily had stopped trying to understand the technical language. Instead, she focused on the expression on his face, the way his brows furrowed when something caught his attention. "There," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "That's it." Emily set down her mug and leaned over his shoulder. On the screen were a series of time-stamped entries, system access points that originated from internal IPs within his company. One address repeated itself with alarming consistency. "Whose is that?" Richard typed quickly, his fingers moving faster with each stroke. "That's Callie's workstation. But look here, there's a pattern. She logged in remotely 3 times after my disappearance." Emily's eyes narrowed. "You think she knows you're still alive?" "No, but she's still monitoring the network, probably to cover her tracks or keep the breach open." He opened a subfolder and clicked on a message log. The screen filled with a string of email headers, some encoded, some partially deleted, but enough to trace. One name jumped out, Mason Keller. Emily didn't recognize it, but Richard did. The way his face darkened made her stomach twist. "Mason's a board member," he said quietly. "Finance director. He was never a threat, or so I thought. But these messages, he's been communicating with someone using a ghost domain registered. Offshore. That's how they've been moving data out of the system." He opened one of the messages. It was short, no subject, no signature, just one line of text. The package was delivered, clean and untraceable. Emily felt a chill crawl down her spine. "You think that's about you?" "It has to be. That message was sent 3 hours after I went missing." He leaned back, the weight of the truth pressing against his chest. Emily sat across from him, gripping the edge of the table. "So what now?" she asked. "I need to confront her," he said. "Not Mason. Not yet. Callie. You said you didn't trust anyone." "I don't. But if I approach her carefully, neutral ground through a secure channel, I can see where she stands, if she's in this willingly or if she's being used. And if she lies, I'll know." They spent the rest of the morning preparing the message. Richard used an encrypted mailer routed through multiple countries to send a request for a private video call. The language was deliberate, formal, but laced with just enough urgency to ensure a response. Then they waited. 2 hours later, a reply arrived. "Agreed, 2 p.m. EST, secure line, no recording." At precisely 2 o'clock, the screen flickered to life. Callie appeared on the other end, seated in a modern, sterile office. Her expression was calm, professional. If she was surprised to see Richard alive, she didn't show it. "Richard," she said, "you look better than expected." "So you knew I was alive?" "I hoped you were," she said evenly, "but I didn't know for sure until now." He studied her carefully. "Then let's skip the games. Why were you accessing the system after my disappearance?" "I was trying to protect you." "From who?" Callie glanced off screen, her jaw tightening. "You don't understand what's happening." "Then explain it to me." She leaned forward slightly. "You stumbled into something bigger than Halbrook Systems. That Atlas protocol you rediscovered. It's not just a security platform, it's a bridge. A tool meant to integrate with third-party systems, public and private. You thought it was dormant, but someone brought it back online through a shell. Firm, I didn't know until after you vanished." "And Mason," she hesitated. "I've seen the logs, Callie." She sighed. "He's in deep. But he's not the only one. There are government contracts tied to this. You start pulling at that thread, and the whole system comes apart. So you covered for them." "No," she said. "I tried to stall. That's why I kept checking the system. I was looking for proof for you. And now you've handed me both." Her eyes flickered with something between relief and regret. Emily watched the exchange from just off screen, out of sight but within earshot. She didn't trust Callie, not yet. But something in the woman's voice rang less like deception and more like resignation. "What do they want now?" Richard asked. "To finish what they started." without you in the way. And what are you going to do? Callie looked directly into the camera. I'm going to give you what you need, but once I do, I'm out. I'm not going to war with these people. Then send it now. She nodded once, then reached off screen again. A file transfer request appeared on Richard's laptop. He watched it load, encrypted system logs, financial records, routing protocols, evidence. It's all there, Callie said, but be careful. Mason's not the brains, he's the mouthpiece. Someone else is running this from the shadows. Before Richard could ask another question, the call ended. Emily stepped forward. You believe her? I believe she was scared. Is that enough? No, but it's a start. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of decoding, cataloging, and analyzing. The files Callie had sent were legitimate, and buried within them was something Richard hadn't expected. A financial transaction trail linking the offshore accounts directly to a consulting firm with quiet ties to Halbrook Systems. A firm registered under a name he hadn't seen in years, Barton Creed. Emily saw the recognition flash across his face. Who is that? A ghost, he said. He vanished 5 years ago after being removed from 3 defense contracts. No one's seen him since. We thought he'd been blacklisted. But he's back. And if he's behind this, we're facing more than corporate theft. Richard stood, his body tense with urgency. We're running out of time. Emily nodded. Then we need to move before they do. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows with a rising fury. Inside the cabin, 2 unlikely allies sat surrounded by secrets, evidence, and the growing certainty that what they had uncovered would change everything. They just had to survive long enough to expose it. By the time the next morning arrived, Emily could sense a shift in Richard. He moved with a purpose that had sharpened overnight, his eyes no longer heavy with doubt, but focused with clarity. The time for quiet investigation had passed. What they held now, the files from Callie, the video footage from the roadside, and the system logs traced through offshore channels, was not just evidence of internal betrayal. It was enough to bring an empire to its knees. Inside the cabin, Emily finished cleaning up the modest breakfast while Richard stood by the window, tapping a sequence of commands into his burner phone. The sky was an iron grey, the kind that promised rain and unrest, and the air felt unusually still, like the moments before a storm arrives. I've set the call, he said, turning to her. Private conference with the board, just the inner circle, no assistants, no external ears. You think they'll come? They'll come, he replied. They can't afford not to. They've been scrambling since my disappearance. Now they'll want answers, and some of them will be desperate to control the narrative before I do. Emily wiped her hands on a towel and stepped closer. What's the plan? We go live. Show them what we found. The logs, the video, the data trail that leads back to Mason and beyond. I let them talk. The guilty ones will show themselves. And if they don't, then I burn it all down. The company, the network, the contracts. I'd rather see it collapse than let them profit from treason. There was no bravado in his tone, only cold certainty. It wasn't revenge that drove him now, but a deep and personal sense of duty. His company had been compromised from within, and the people he had trusted most had sold that trust to the highest bidder. He set up the video conference station in Emily's small living room, using the old laptop connected through a secure, virtual bridge. She helped adjust the camera, positioning it just right so the fireplace was behind Richard, giving him the appearance of a man who had survived and returned with fire at his back. The call went live at noon sharp. The screen divided into 6 squares, each displaying a different member of Halbrook Systems' executive board. Some faces looked relieved to see Richard alive. Others looked calculating. One, Mason Keller, offered a smile too smooth, too rehearsed. "Richard," Mason said, his voice oily with false concern, "we thought you were dead." "I'm not," Richard replied, "which is going to be a problem for some of you." He didn't wait for a response. Instead, he shared his screen and began projecting the evidence. First the breach logs, then the transaction records, finally the security footage from the camera near the crash site. The silence that followed was absolute. "Is this a joke?" one board member asked. "No," Richard said. "That is me, unconscious, being dragged from my vehicle, and that is a man on Dameron Intel's payroll assisting in the operation." Mason leaned forward, the mask beginning to slip. "Even if that's true, you have no proof it was sanctioned by anyone here. I traced the financial route from our internal funds to your ghost accounts. I have IP logs showing unauthorized system access from your terminal. And I have emails, coded but traceable, linking you to Barton Creed's reactivation project." Mason laughed, but the sound was hollow now. "You're reaching, Richard." Richard didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to another board member, a woman named Rachel Morris, who had once been his closest ally in the early days of Halbrook Systems. She looked shaken. "Rachel," he said, "you authorized the last systems audit. Did you know they were using your clearance?" "I didn't," she said quickly. "But I should have. I didn't ask questions, Richard. I didn't want to. Believe—" Her voice trailed off. "That's how it happens," he said. "Silence, denial, and before you know it, your company is selling access codes to adversaries." "You don't have enough to go public," Mason said, desperation creeping into his tone now. "Not without exposing everything, including your own failings." "You're right," Richard said. "If I go public, we all burn." He let the silence sit for a beat. "Which is why this isn't about going public, not yet. This is about cleaning house." He turned to the camera, now speaking directly to the group. "They're effective immediately. I'm freezing all financial operations tied to Division 7 and 8. I've already locked out the compromised servers. The offshore transactions are being reversed through a federal compliance report that was filed last night under emergency protocol. Mason, you're done. And if anyone else here is working with Creed, now is the time to speak up." On the screen, Mason's square disappeared. He had disconnected. Richard didn't flinch. He turned to the others. "This is your one chance to make things right. You help me clean this up, or you watch from the sidelines as I dismantle the entire board." The call ended minutes later with only one dissenting vote. Richard sat back, eyes closed, his body trembling not with fear, but with release. Emily stepped behind him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did it." "No," he said, "we did it." But as they sat in that moment of quiet victory, something didn't feel quite finished. Richard turned toward the screen again, replaying the footage. Emily watched too, her eyes narrowing. "Wait," she said. "Pause that." He did. She stepped closer. Zoom in on the reflection, there in the SUV window. He enlarged the image, grainy and distorted. But she was right. There was a reflection of someone standing further back, watching. "Who is that?" she asked. Richard stared. "I don't know." The figure was too vague to identify, a shadow behind the shadows. The implication chilled them both. If Mason had help, and that help wasn't on the call today, then someone else was still out there, watching, waiting. "Whoever it is," Emily said, "they're going to come for you." "They already did," Richard replied. "Now they'll come for us both." Outside, the wind howled louder than before. The storm had not passed. It had only just begun. The hours that followed the confrontation with the board passed in a kind of suspended time. Richard barely moved from his place at the table, his eyes fixed on the screen, replaying the footage over and over. The other board members had gone. Silent, their calls unanswered, their responses limited to vague acknowledgements and unconvincing promises of cooperation. Mason had disappeared, his last known location traced to a private airfield outside Atlanta, and the reflection in the SUV window, dark, watching, anonymous, lingered like a specter none of them could shake. Emily remained close but quiet, observing Richard as he spiraled deeper into analysis. She didn't interrupt. She didn't speak unless necessary. Instead, she watched, absorbing every moment, every pause, every hesitation. It wasn't detachment, it was calculation. Something in her had shifted, subtly at first, but now, like a tide rising in the dark, it was undeniable. She sat at the table that night long after Richard had gone to lie down. The image of the shadowed figure burned into her mind. Something didn't sit right, not just with the footage, but with how everything had unfolded. from the moment she found Richard on the road to the unraveling of this conspiracy. It wasn't the kind of awareness born from suspicion. It was instinct. A quiet, persistent awareness that something still lay beneath the surface, untouched. She opened the files again, clicking through the logs and documentation Callie had sent. Richard had gone through all of it already, but Emily wasn't looking for what he was. She wasn't a systems analyst or a cybersecurity expert. She didn't understand code or server access points, but she understood people. And as she followed the paper trail, emails, memos, meeting requests, she found a pattern that no algorithm would catch. One executive, one man on the board, appeared in every crucial moment. Not Mason, not Creed. Someone who had remained silent on every call, voted in Richard's favor, supported his initiatives quietly over the years. A man who had worn the mask of loyalty so convincingly that even Richard hadn't suspected him. Kenneth Doyle, the board's legal liaison, a man whose job was to make things disappear quietly, whose role in the company was built on erasing conflicts before they reached legal complications. In the emails, she saw his name pop up at all the right times, in threads about asset reallocation, in internal policy revisions, in obscure system changes that made it possible for other board members to redirect resources without setting off alarms. She stared at the screen, her heart beginning to pound. Richard had missed it because he was looking at the obvious threats, the ones with noise, with visible movement. But Doyle had played a quieter game. And in the reflection from the SUV window there had been something, glasses, a faint glint, the same angular frames Doyle always wore. Emily woke Richard, her voice low but insistent. He followed her to the table, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and listened as she laid it all out. The pattern, the timing, the reflection. He didn't speak for a long time. When he did, it wasn't with denial, but with stunned recognition. "Doyle," he whispered. "God, it was Doyle." "He's the one holding the strings," Emily said. "Mason was the bait, Creed the ghost. But Doyle's the one who set the fire and watched everyone chase the smoke." Richard sank into the chair, the weight of the realization crashing over him. He's the reason we never found the original breach. He authorized the audit team. He revised the network protocol. And he made sure your disappearance looked like an accident. The pieces fell into place. Doyle had manipulated the structure from the inside, playing both sides against the middle. And now, with Mason exposed and Creed on the fringe, he was likely orchestrating the next move, preparing to erase any remaining threats, including Richard and Emily. "We have to confront him," Emily said, "but not like you did with the board, not on a call." Richard looked at her. "For you want to meet him?" "No," she said, "I want him to meet us." They worked through the night on the setup. Richard reached out to Doyle through a secure message, posing as Callie, claiming she had more information and wanted to meet in person, a neutral location, a chance to fix what Mason had ruined. They picked an abandoned feed store on the edge of a nearby town. Emily knew it well. Her father had worked there once before the business folded. It was isolated, easy to secure with multiple exits and no neighbors nearby. They arrived at dawn, set up hidden cameras using the same system Richard had used to secure his own offices, and waited. Doyle arrived alone just before 8. He drove a nondescript rental car, dressed in dark slacks and a grey coat, his face as unreadable as ever. Emily watched from behind a partition as Richard stepped out to greet him. "Callie said you had something for me," Doyle said, his tone smooth. "She lied," Richard replied. Doyle's eyes narrowed slightly. "So, you're alive? You sound disappointed." "I sound realistic. Your return complicates things." "You mean it exposes things," Richard said. Doyle didn't flinch. "You've made a mess. Mason was reckless. Creed's unstable. But this witch hunt of yours, it'll cost you everything." "Then why are you here?" "Because I'm still the only one who can fix this," Doyle replied. "You can't win, Richard. Even if you go public, you won't survive the backlash. You think the media will make you a hero? You think shareholders will stand by as you burn their assets?" "You're scared," Richard said. "I can see it." "I'm calculating," Doyle replied. And I calculate that if you walk away now quietly, you'll survive, and so will your company. Walk away and let you keep selling it off piece by piece. You think they'll thank you for blowing the whistle. They'll blame you for failing to protect it in the first place. Richard stepped closer. I'd rather be blamed for the truth than praised for a lie. Doyle smirked. Then you're a fool. At that moment, Emily stepped out from behind the partition. Doyle turned, surprise flickering across his face for the first time. You're not the smartest one in the room anymore, she said. Doyle's expression hardened, but before he could speak, the click of multiple phones echoed in the room. Each camera, each mic, each backup drive recording everything. Richard looked at him one last time. It's over. Doyle said nothing. He turned and walked out, getting into his car, his face blank. They didn't stop him. They didn't have to. They had everything they needed. Back at the cabin, Emily sat on the steps, the weight of the night finally settling into her bones. Richard joined her, handing her a cup of coffee. You saw what I didn't, he said. I just saw what you couldn't. They drank in silence, the storm finally beginning to pass, the first rays of clean morning light spilling through the trees. But they both knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The days that followed the confrontation with Kenneth Doyle unfolded, like the slow turning of a key in a locked door. Richard and Emily had what they needed. They had the footage, the files, the recorded conversation, every thread of evidence connecting the conspiracy back to its architect. But the real weight of the truth didn't land until they stood at the edge of the decision that had always been waiting for them, what to do with it all. Doyle hadn't run. That was the first sign. He was still in his office the following day, still attending company calls, still issuing vague statements about restructuring and compliance. It was his way of challenging them, of daring them to act, a signal that he wasn't afraid of exposure because he believed they wouldn't dare. And for a moment, Richard didn't, not out of cowardice but strategy. He knew what a public war would cost: stockholder trust, market partnerships, legal scrutiny. Every deal he had worked years to secure could crumble in a matter of weeks. The company might survive, but not in the shape he had built. And worst of all, Emily and Noah, who had given him shelter, safety, and ultimately the clarity to see what mattered, could be caught in the crossfire. He spent 2 days writing statements, revising them, deleting them. One version was bold and direct, naming names and detailing crimes. Another was quieter, framing the investigation as a misstep corrected internally. He hated both. Neither told the truth of what had happened. Neither honored the cost of what they had survived. It was Emily who broke the silence one night after. Noah had gone to bed and the air was thick with unfinished thoughts. "You're not going back, are you?" she asked. Richard didn't answer immediately. He sat by the fire, staring at the flickering light. He hadn't worn a suit in over a week, hadn't touched a corporate device since the day he confronted the board. In the absence of all his routines, he had found something he hadn't expected: peace. "I could," he said finally. "I could. Take the files to the authorities, force Doyle out, rebuild from the ashes. But that's not what you want. I used to think the company was everything," he said, "that if I lost it, I'd lose myself. But now I see it for what it really was: a structure, an idea. It's not who I am." He looked at her, his expression bare. "You showed me that." Emily shook her head. "You just needed someone to say it out loud." They sat in silence for a while longer, until Richard stood and crossed the room to the old desk by the window. He pulled a manila envelope from the drawer. Inside were the flash drives, the evidence, the final copies of the files Callie had sent, and the footage from the roadside. "I'm sending this to the Department of Justice," he said, "with a full report, anonymous. Let them do what they're supposed to do." "And the company?" "I'm resigning, effective immediately. Let someone else fight that war." Emily raised an eyebrow. "And what will you do instead? Move to the mountains, write a memoir?" He smiled, but it was faint. "I've been thinking about that." He took a breath, then turned to her with the kind of look that marked the beginning of something new. "I want to start a foundation," he said. "Small, local, community-based. Support, education, healthcare, real impact, something honest." She blinked, surprised. "In Tennessee." "Why not?" he asked. I've seen what this place does to people who are left behind. I can help change that with your help." Emily stood, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "You want me to run it? I want you to lead it," he said. "You're the reason I'm alive." Richard sat and watched a few children chase each other through the grass, laughter rising like music into the air. The world they had fought to protect, the truth they had exposed, now lived in the everyday smiles of people who had once been forgotten. He turned to Emily. "Do you ever think about that night?" "The rain?" she asked. "The man in the road?" He nodded. "I think about it every time I lock the doors at night," she said. "Not because I'm afraid. Because it reminds me how fast everything can change. So you could have driven past." "I could have," she agreed, "but I didn't. That decision saved my life. It changed mine." They fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that only came from shared battles and mutual respect. There had never been a declaration between them, no romantic gesture or whispered promise. But in the quiet way they moved around each other, in the looks exchanged across rooms and the decisions made without speaking, there was something stronger than words, an understanding forged in fire and honesty. Richard reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded letter. "What's that?" Emily asked. "Closure," he said, handing it to her. She unfolded the letter and read it in silence. It was addressed to the remaining members of the Hullbrook Systems Board, a final account of what had transpired, what had been uncovered, and why he had chosen not to return. It wasn't angry, it wasn't vengeful, it was the truth, plain and firm, with a note at the end that stated simply, "Do better than we did." She handed it back, her expression unreadable. "You sure you're done?" "I'm sure," he said. "The company doesn't need me, and I don't need it." Later that week, a reporter from a small regional publication visited the center. She had heard rumors of a former tech mogul starting a non-profit in rural Tennessee and wanted to write a human interest piece. Richard agreed to an interview on one condition. The story wasn't about him. He introduced her to the volunteers, the families, the programs. He showed her the pantry, the reading room, the job training office. "When they see," she asked about his past. He pointed her to Emily. "She's the reason I'm here," he said. "Start your story with her." The article, published 2 weeks later, bore the title, "The Woman Who Rescued a Stranger and Rebuilt a Town." It spread slowly through local networks, then faster through social media. Donations trickled in, followed by offers of support from regional businesses. The center expanded to offer legal assistance, mental health counseling, and after-school tutoring. Every time someone new walked through the door, Emily made a point of greeting them personally. One evening, as the sun dipped, below the hills and the center emptied out, Richard and Emily walked the perimeter, inspecting a new shipment of supplies. "Do you ever think we'll leave this place?" he asked. "Not anytime soon," she said. "There's too much left to do." "I'm okay with that." They reached the end of the garden path and stopped. Fireflies blinked in the distance, and the air carried the scent of earth and new beginnings. "I used to think saving the world meant doing something big," he said. Emily looked at him. "Turns out saving one person can be big enough." He nodded. "You saved me." She smiled softly. "You made it worth it." As they turned to head back toward the center, the porch light flicked on automatically, casting a warm glow over the steps. Inside, the laughter of a child echoed. From the playroom and somewhere beyond, the sound of hope, quiet, steady, real, settled into the bones of the building. They walked side by side, no longer as a man running from his past or a woman trapped by hers, but as two people who had faced the storm and chosen, together, to build something stronger in its wake. Not a rescue, not a romance, but a beginning. And this time, one they owned.